ice age, given the current human influence on the entire Earth system. We're really in an non-analog state for the Earth system, which actually places, I would argue, the really big quest for global sustainability science, illustrated here by a fantastic graph unpublished yet by Martin Scheffer and Will Steffen et al. That we're working on right now, that we know fairly well the limit cycles of the Earth system. We have the 100,000 Milankovic kind of periodicity on ice ages, and that we now have faced a point where we're exiting that interglacial sliver of Garden of Eden that we've had since the last 12,000 years, and that the big quest for global sustainable development is to be able to stay within a governed Earth manageable interglacial state and avoiding crossing thresholds that could irreversibly flip feedbacks and take us into a hothouse state that could no longer support neither poverty alleviation nor human well-being, and certainly not prosperity for a world of 7.6 moving to 9.5 billion co-citizens on Earth. And that this is backed up, as we all know here, of course, by an equation that I would argue kind of manifests the great advancements of Earth system science over the last 30 years. The empirical evidence that we are in the new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, the empirical evidence that the interglacial Holocene state is and was a prerequisite for civilizational development as we know it, and that Earth tipping points are part of normality, that long periods of Earth resilience can suddenly be juxtaposed from crossing tipping points and irreversibly moving into completely new states that can undermine the ability for sustainable development. Which means that we now should seriously consider moving away from the 1992 modern definition of sustainable development in terms of intergenerational responsibility for reducing environmental impacts to actually having it as defined as it seriously should be in the Anthropocene. It is about world development on a stable and resilient Earth system. But this has an even deeper implication, I would argue. It has a kind of a philosophical deep point in why it's so critical right now with the Sustainable Development Goals, which comes as follows. We have the empirical evidence now, I would argue, even unequivocally on the table, that it's the last 50 years that we have destabilized the conditions for human civilizations over the past 10,000 years. But we have equal increasing amount of evidence to suggest that it is what we do over the next 50 years that will be determining the outcome for humanity over the coming 10,000 years. And I'm kind of looking a bit in the audience here, and perhaps I'm a bit grayer than you are, but I've been around for the last 50 years. So I'm a victim. I'll hand up my hand. I've been part of taking us into this Anthropocene risk zone. And I hope to be here for better parts, at least, of the coming 50 years. So this is the time. This is us. This is the generation that has the possibility and responsibility now to guide the transformation towards a sustainable development future that combines equity and justice for 9.5 billion people on a stable and resilient Earth system. And of course, we've seen the hockey stick patterns that lays behind this evidence. We know it. But just a reminder that this is, of course, a fundamental piece of research showing that we've entered the Anthropocene, that all the curves look like this, that we entered the Anthropocene in the mid-1950s, we're 3.5 billion people. That's when we put in the high gear of the industrial metabolism that has taken us to the point where we no longer have any excuse for combining world and Earth in sustainable development. But I would argue that the key finding is that it's not until 1990 that we enter the saturation point. That between the entering of the Great Acceleration and 1990, we still operate unsustainably with a world economic model that kind of moves along a GDP growth pattern on linear production systems, where we largely actually can subsidize human well-being by exploiting oceans, forests, loading atmosphere with greenhouse gases. But the Earth system is so resilient, it can absorb and dampen and maintain negative feedbacks. It's in 1990 the cod fisheries collapse out of Newfoundland. It's in 1990 Steve Carpenter really maps out the flips in lake systems in the US, giving him the Stockholm Water Prize just a few years back. It's in 1990 the Baltic Sea flips from its oxygen-rich to its anoxic state that we currently have as an algal bloom frequent state in the northern parts of the hemisphere. It's in 1990 that we passed 350 ppm in carbon dioxide equivalents in the atmosphere. It's in 1990 we start seeing the first evidence of accelerated melt in the Arctic Sea. It seems like the 1990 is the point where we start, as Will Steffen points out, hitting the hardwired biophysical ceiling of the processes that regulate the Earth system. It's in 1990, as Professor John Schellenhuber often points out, we reached the saturation point. And it's therefore just in the last 25 years, actually exactly the time of existence of the Potsdam Institute, that we have reached the point where we no longer can operate along this planet-subsidized human well-being and gives us development, where in fact we now need to transition into a completely new logic where everything we do, prosperity, development, poverty alleviation, occurs within Earth's safe operating space. It gives this message from science, which is quite simple, that up until 1990, we are still this relatively small world on a big planet. We can actually kind of deliver on human well-being, try to reduce environmental impacts as much as we can, but still not be sustainable. On the aggregate, we still have rebound effects taking us towards unsustainability, and there are no invoices sent back from the Earth system into societies. But it's since 1990 onwards that we are the relatively big world on a small planet. We have reached a completely new position. And we have the evidence, and the evidence comes largely from this room again. I think the synthesis on Earth system tipping points that we are at risk of triggering if we push the system beyond the saturation point is a phenomenal piece of work into the sustainable development agenda. Just this reminder that it's not only ice sheets, it is big biomes, it is the monsoon rain system, it is big systems that regulates the Earth system stability, but also provides our ability to really build sustainable development. The following graph, and I know many of you need to have the kind of acknowledgement for this one, I would argue that every climate negotiator, every sustainable development policymaker should have the following graph in his or her hand, because I think it's a phenomenal piece of information why the precautionary principle must be applied. The reminder that the last 20,000 years, we exit the last ice age, we enter this Garden of Eden period, the Holocene of the last 12,000 years. You see average temperature on Earth on the y-axis, the plus minus 1 degree Celsius, really Garden of Eden, narrow stability zone we were in. The reminder that the Paris range of staying below 2 is actually outside of the Holocene equilibrium, so saying that we are actually not in a return point, we are even at best at a manageable interglacial state, and loading on that the evidence we have today on the risk of pushing systems that regulate the ability for sustainable development across tipping points. And as you see, and this reminder I think one always needs, that coral reefs lies within Paris. And they're all dipping into Paris here on the left-hand side, alpine glaciers, Arctic sea ice, even Greenland. And Greenland is important here because not only of the 7-meter sea level rise risk, but the recognition that we might be pushing the on button much earlier than the impact hits on sustainable development, which raises the question of morality. What is our moral time zone of obligation? I would argue that that should certainly be beyond 100 years and certainly beyond 300 years. Now, if we take just these kind of hotspot systems, the number one kind of canary in the gold mine is clearly the Arctic. And just before President Barack Obama left the White House, he engaged tremendously, as you may know, in the Arctic. He gathered science in the Glaciers Initiative in Alaska, and then he asked science to prepare this report that we were working, many of us, together on, showing the evidence that 2 degrees Celsius warming in the world means 5 degrees Celsius in the Arctic, that the amplifying effect actually leads to one of the biomes that regulates the stability on Earth into a, you could call it, disaster zone. The other canary in the gold mine is clearly coral reefs in the world. And I think the following piece of evidence is nothing less than shocking, actually. In 1998, you recall the El Niño event that hit most of the coral reef systems in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific and Caribbean across tipping points. But the Great Barrier Reef was resilient enough to withstand that bleaching event. Then we get an amplified El Niño event in 2015-2016 with almost 80% bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. Now that in a resilient system can still rise after that shock. But in 2017, this year, another bleaching event hit the Great Barrier Reef, and the latest documentation and observations from TERI Hughes and colleagues at the James Cook University shows that 50% of the Great Barrier Reef has crossed an irreversible tipping point and is dead. So we've lost half of the Great Barrier Reef. I think this is a signal of the seriousness in terms of sustainable development, knowing that 250 million people have their livelihoods directly coupled to the coastal zone sources of livelihoods originating from coral reefs, from fisheries to tourism. We have all the evidence on another biome, which is in the rainforest, showing the risk of tipping point to savannization, the work, the phenomenal work of Niklas Boers and others on tipping point induced by monsoon system interactions, the moisture feedback interactions that we see in tipping points in Amazon, and the latest paper from Woods Hole showing that rainforest systems in the world have now kind of flipped over, it appears, from being a net source to a net sink. Not the other way around, net sink to net source. And that this is one of these very, very serious signals of a system that no longer is obviously stable enough to support sustainable development. So it's not a surprise that the equation was turned in 2009 from Anthropocene, Holocene tipping points into a world on a stable and resilient Earth system. It was actually turned logically into the next step in Earth system science, trying to say quantitative safe boundaries within which we can have a manageable interglacial state of the Earth system. That is what the planetary boundary framework is. It tries to define the Earth system processes that regulates the Earth system and define for sustainable development the space within which we can prosper. And you've probably seen the 2009 launch of this, the 2015 update, which is a kind of a guide for sustainable development, which has increasingly been integrated in both business and policy and has inspired also the sustainable development goals in its framing on social, economic, and sustainable development in the Earth system. Business is picking this up at a wide scale, as you may be aware. The World Business Council has transformed the planetary boundaries into their Action 2020, putting sustainability within their business models, not as a corporate social responsibility. The B team and others doing the same. A number of countries are also trying to downscale planetary boundaries into their kind of guiding development in the future. We have a number of organizations doing similarly, from the UN to the OECD, and we're working right now with the Global Environment Facility to redefine the global commons in the Anthropocene, recognizing that there's no such thing as externalities that are not integral to economy and sustainable development. We see a number of world transformations occurring in this context. In this report to the Global Environment Facility, we identify the urgent need to transform the world energy system, decarbonize the energy system, transformation towards sustainable cities, transforming towards healthy and sustainable food systems, and a transformation to a circular economy as the 4 fast-track pathways for sustainable development in the future. And in closing, I just want to give you an example of how this translates to sustainable development. So if we are at this state, and we need to stay within a global carbon budget of a safe operating space for a stable Earth system, it translates, interestingly, into a Moore's Law-inspired innovation and transformation pathway. We published this recently with colleagues at PIC in Science on the global carbon law, which goes very quickly as follows. When you translate Paris into what has to happen, it has, as we all know, this decarbonization pathway of bending the curve of emissions no later than 2020 for carbon dioxide, fossil fuel burning in the gray zone here, down to roughly a fossil fuel-free world economy 2050-2060. But that is not enough, as we know. It requires this transition from the world food system in brown, from a carbon source to a carbon sink, an agricultural revolution. But not even that is enough. We have to, whether we like it or not, consider scaling carbon capture and storage and BECCS at a very large scale. And not even that is enough. We need to maintain the natural carbon sinks in the biosphere, on land and ocean. And even if we do all this, even if we are at this energy revolution, the food revolution, the CCS scaling, and an Earth resilience revolution, I would argue, we have a 75% chance of reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius and staying below 2. So this is why we have proposed that this translates into a carbon law of halving emissions every decade. And if we can halve emissions every decade, we follow a Paris path on the decarbonization pathway, which directly gives you a connection between Earth system science and sustainable development, which argues very strongly for the need of stronger planetary stewardship. That is no longer acceptable that nations individually decide, look here, we're now going to go egoistic a few years because we don't have the ability to kind of contribute towards collective progress, and that is not the state we can consider acceptable in the Anthropocene. That we need to simply abandon this old definition of sustainable development in its 3 pillars. And I'm a great, one of my biggest heroes is Gro Harlem Brundtland, who led the whole Rio Brundtland Commission. But it was set up as the human, ecological, and natural dimensions of sustainable development, and we simply must admit it failed. It became a Mickey Mouse economy overall. The economy grew, yes, thank you, at the expense of human capital and natural capital, and that this must now be really forcefully integrated into the Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 goals, the first time ever humanity has a roadmap for aspirational socioeconomic goals within planetary boundaries of freshwater, climate, biodiversity, and oceans. And we have now gathered the scientific community, and many of you are involved in this, in the World in 2050, which is an effort of getting the integrated assessment modeling community, analysts from local to global scale, to really explore transformation pathways of how do we attain the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, but then continue these pathways until 2050 within planetary boundaries in a way that achieves the social goals while staying on a stable and resilient Earth system. It translates scientifically, actually, that the 17 goals cannot be, as they often are, seen as a Swedish smorgasbord, where you kind of pick your goodies and just do what you feel able to do. It must actually be translated into a wedding cake where 4 of the boundaries, 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals, are non-negotiable. They're the platform within which we can achieve the social and economic goals. So as a closing slide, just to give you another little equation then for sustainable development in a world of turbulence and in a world of the Anthropocene, may be simply that we need to shift over Mickey Mouse towards a wedding cake can give us a world prosperity of sustainable development within a resilient and stable Earth system. And this is a completely new agenda, and luckily we're starting to see the first elements of recognition in the political leadership in the world through the Sustainable Development Goals. The key challenge is keep them together and start concretizing them at the local scale. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions, so please, hands up. I try to see you. Okay, there's one hand. I guess you can see it.
I'd like to ask you a very personal question, because you said you've been around for 50 years. I've been around for a few years less, and I'm actually born in the midst of the 70s, and that happens to be the time when the Club of Rome and Meadows first talked about limits of growth. Just a very personal question. Why should I be... what is different now? Because I've heard throughout my life lists of aspirations, of goals, MDGs, and 1992 as a big step forward and so on, but still a lot of things are still going wrong. What's different now? What should give me hope that this is different?
Yeah, thanks. I love this question because those are the kind of 5 slides I deleted in the end because of the short timeline here. So to begin with, what is different is, of course, the fact that we're the first generation to sit on the evidence that we've reached this saturation point. When Rachel Carson wrote her Silent Spring in 1962, or when the Limits to Growth came out in 1972, shot down, by the way, as we all know, by policy and business around the world, they were just at the beginning of these exponential curves of human pressure. I mean, it was really even uncertain where the curves would be heading. It could actually be a linear projection. So I would argue that one thing that is different is the responsibility. But the most important difference is that we're seeing a very significant, just over the last 5-6 years, I would argue, tipping point where sustainability has moved from being, the big sacrifice, the big climate negotiating war between the trench war of developing versus developed countries over compensation and responsibility of historic risk, looking at climate, for example, as an environmental risk and an environmental issue, to now having tipped over where sustainability increasingly is seen as an opportunity space, as a pathway to more competitive and more attractive and more advanced solutions. If I had time here, I would have shown you that we're actually following the global carbon law. We're seeing the pace that Professor Klinsing last night showed us of the renewable energy, which has gone from 0.8% to 2.8% on global energy provision in the world, even though these numbers are very small, they follow a doubling every 5th year. Every 5th year, renewable energy in the world is doubling. And if you project that pace into the future, it follows the global carbon law. And it actually means that just business as usual takes us to a world fossil fuel-free economy by 2045. I mean, if we would be able to keep the exponential pace into the future. So I think there's a lot of hope in terms of the tipping point and the recognition that sustainability is the new entry point. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs points out, and I support him, we're now in the era of sustainable development. I think that is a significant difference compared to just 30 years back when everything we were talking about the environment was still an environmental issue. And the question was, how much are we willing to sacrifice to deal with the problem? Now it's rather a different story. It's almost like a race. Who will be most successful in terms of should we or should we not go deep into sustainability? This is a very optimistic assessment, though, because we see how things go up and down in the world, but I think that is a change.
Okay, I have to cut off now because we have to jump to the next speaker. Many thanks. If we have time, there might be 10 minutes left over at the very end. Many thanks, Johan. So, as we all know, we are here at the Climate Change Impact Conference, but climate change or climate action is only one of the SDGs, and they are all interacting. And I'm happy to welcome Leena Srivastava from TERI University, and she will talk about policy coherence and integrated approaches to the SDGs. And the floor is yours.
Good morning. From macro to micro, from natural systems to human systems, from white male to brown female, from tall to short. Please reset your expectations, because it's very difficult to follow Johan when you're speaking on this particular subject. But what I'm going to speak to you about today is climate change and SDGs and policy coherence. The title is somewhat different from what I had presented earlier. I was hoping to talk about implementation challenges, but the time will not permit that, so I've shortened my presentation just a wee bit. So what did I want to talk about? Well, for one, I think when we are talking about policy coherence and the linkages between climate change and sustainable development, it's something that I think we started taking on board in 2001 or in preparations for the third assessment report itself. And I think in 2001, in the third assessment report, we recognized the interlinkages between climate change and human and natural ecosystems. And this found reflection also in COP7 in Marrakesh, where I think it was said during the ministerial declaration, if you focus on the second bullet point over there, that problems of poverty, land degradation, access to water, food, human health remain at the center of global attention, and synergies therefore need to be given attention to. I'm not going to get into detail of that, but I think we started recognizing it there, and that was the very simple diagram that was put forward in the third assessment report of the IPCC. The interlinkage diagrams that you see today are so complex, so we have moved a long way from then till now in 2014, when the fifth assessment report of the IPCC came out. And I think there again we recognized very clearly in the summary for policymakers, if you look at it, that adaptation and mitigation are complementary strategies for reducing and managing the risks of climate change. But more importantly, if you look at SPM 3.1, it says delaying mitigation shifts burdens from the present to the future. And insufficient adaptation responses to emerging impacts are already eroding the basis for sustainable development. This, I think, is a key statement which, again, fed into the Paris negotiations that took place, the conference of the 21st Conference of Parties that took place in Paris. And if you look at it, in the Paris Agreement, we recognize that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and its adverse impacts undermine the ability of all countries to achieve sustainable development. Again, I won't read the whole paragraph, but I think there was a very explicit recognition of the linkages between climate change and sustainable development goals. And it also says that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the right of indigenous peoples, and so on. So the Paris Agreement very clearly brought in sustainable development goals. And I think there was a very interesting paper which I've tried to show over here that shows that if our ambition levels are not, okay, I'm not getting the, okay. If you look at the low ambition scenario, then we are at a very high risk of failure to achieve the SDGs, and the color codes, tell them all. But if we have a high ambition scenario for climate change, then of course we will have a better chance of remaining with SDGs. Agenda 2030, on the other hand, also recognizes this interlinkages very clearly, and it says that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets which we are announcing are integrated, indivisible, and balance the three pillars of sustainable development. So in 2015, I think we reached a point where both these key agreements recognized very strongly the interlinkages and the fact that you cannot deal with just one of the SDGs, recognizing that climate change also is part of SDG, is in SDGs as SDG 13. So you cannot anymore look at only one aspect of our overall development, but you have to be able to look at the interlinkages, and that's where I think the complexities are all coming from. Yesterday it was mentioned, I think a few times, that energy sits at the center. Definitely for climate change, it's a very major contributor of greenhouse gases and the problem of climate change, but I think even in the context of energy, we are able to draw linkages with at least 11 other SDGs, and it is the basis by which we are able to address the other SDGs as well. So energy is something that we really need to focus on, and I wanted to move from here to be able to say how easy or difficult it is to really bring about those transformations that we are talking about. From Johan's presentation, we get the feeling that we understand the natural systems much, much better than we do the human systems, and we are possibly, from my presentation, hopefully we get a sense of the challenges that we have in bringing about transformations in the human system that we are talking about. So I'm going to take India as an example of this kind of transformation that we are looking at and focus on India's energy-related targets and impacts and what is it that we are doing with them. Very quickly, India's 2022 renewable energy target was a whopping 175 gigawatts of energy. This was, at the time when we announced this, more or less equivalent to the entire capacity, not in generation terms, capacity of energy that we had, very close to it in India. So 175 gigawatts was huge, and if you can, as you can see from here, there are targets for wind, which was 60 gigawatts, and in solar we broke it up we had about 60 gigawatts from large solar projects and 40 gigawatts from rooftop solar projects that we were aiming for. So very ambitious target announced by Prime Minister Modi around the time that India's political system changed from one of a very large coalition-based government for the last 20 years prior to the Modi government to one where we had a government that was very strong and literally had no opposition and had the opportunity, therefore, to do a lot of things and push through a lot of programs and legislation that was required for this purpose. But where are we? I'm not sure if you can see this, see the writing on this. But if you look at the 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022, on the positive side, what we have experienced in India is that through the reverse bidding processes that we followed, that the price of renewable energy came down enormously. In the case of solar, this was a trend that we saw particularly last year that took off, and the price came down to 2 rupees 44 paise per unit. If you compare that, I mean, the exchange rate at this time is roughly about 64 rupees for the dollar that we are speaking about. So 2 rupees 44 paise per unit in May. In February, it was 2 rupees 97 paise. So just look at the drop in those 3 or 4 months that took place in solar prices, and compare it with the price of coal-based thermal power generation, which was 3 rupees 20 paise per unit. So, solar prices were already well below the price of grid-connected thermal energy that we were talking about. Earlier this month, we decided to adopt and do away with a lot of the incentives that were provided to wind and move to a bidding process, and the price for wind came down to 2 rupees 64 paise, and this is expected to go down further. So it's no surprise that today India is very, very belligerent about its renewable energy program. So this is all on the positive side. But on the negative side, what has happened? When we got prices down to this level, all the previous contracts that we had for renewable energy suddenly opened up, because the discovery price came down so low, and when we were looking at accelerated depreciation or generation-based incentives, as the incentives for promoting renewable energy, the price that we had was significantly higher. So all old contracts were getting reopened. Second, all the new bids in different geographies were expected to match up with this lowest bid irrespective of the conditions. So this really points out to the fact that there is a little bit of lack of understanding, and maybe I'm being very optimistic here, on how the system works. So we are now then therefore running into the risk where financial institutions are becoming extremely nervous with this very aggressive bidding and the very aggressive approach that governments, state governments in particular, are taking on the price of renewable energy. And so therefore, finances are no longer forthcoming, and we have a situation where there are distress sales of projects that are taking place. So this is something that we need to worry about. We are talking about a very short time frame, 2022 in the case of India's goals, 2030 is what we had committed for in Paris and the NDCs that we have. So we are talking about very small time frames, and we have to learn a lot, and many people have to learn in this particular time frame that we are talking about. We also announced a couple of months ago, that India is going to ban sale of diesel and petrol vehicles by 2030. Now, India in the last year sold 3 million passenger vehicles and a total of about 28 million vehicles, a large part of which are two-wheelers, because India is still relatively poor, affordability is still low, so two-wheelers is a very popular mode of travel. So 28 million vehicles is what we are talking about, what we have produced today. With incomes going up and the rates of growth, we can easily expect this number to be significantly higher when we come to the year 2030. But the current electric vehicle manufacturing capacity is negligible, so just imagine the kind of ramp-up that will have to take place in terms of manufacturing, and we would not want to be in a position where we are importing all our needs. Battery manufacturing and costs remain a major concern, and in the country there is very little capacity that exists. And the urban support infrastructure that is needed for being able to support electric vehicles is huge. The only positive side on this is that India has already announced and has got some experience behind it, positive and negative, on the smart cities programs that we are running. So there is some momentum that has already built up, but we have still an extremely long way to go before we are able to even start feeling comfortable about this. So when we look at 2030, it's just around the corner. And then do we have a transition strategy? I don't think so. If sales ban comes into effect from 2030, manufacturers are likely to stop production of new models by 2025 or earlier. And I'm talking about this in the context of the auto fuel vision policy that India came out with. I was part of the committee that looked at it. And I know that vehicle manufacturers would like to have a lead time of at least 3 to 4 years before they want to move from one production line to another to some other model that we are talking about. Otherwise, they don't get the returns that they are looking for. So this is going to be a major challenge. And there are also uncertainties around the current programs. So we had the target of moving to Euro 6 equivalent vehicles by 2021-22. And if by 2025 we are going to say we don't want these at all, what's going to happen to the programs on the refinery upgradations, on the vehicles, etc.? We don't have a strategy in place. So it's all very well to make these big announcements, and I think it is something that we were all very happy about. But the challenge really lies in how is it that you're going to convert these announcements into something that delivers on the ground, and I think that is one of the key major challenges. Similarly, in the area of energy efficiency, I think there's been some very interesting learning that has taken place in the last 2-3 years since this new government has come into place and after the Paris Agreement. Major programs on lighting have been put in place, on improved pump set efficiencies, on industrial energy efficiency, and so on. And what is new over here is that the body responsible for promoting energy efficiency has actually redefined its own role to become a market aggregator. So it's become a procurer of each of these kinds of more efficient appliances, and they have created the volumes that are needed for industry to respond. And I've also taken on the responsibility of ensuring that standards are met and that there's a certification that is provided, thereby building some confidence in the market that otherwise didn't exist. So this is on the positive side. On the negative side, if I take a look at what's happening on waste to energy, you may or may not have heard in Delhi on the outskirts, we had a landslide on the dump, the municipal dump of municipal waste that we had, in which a few people also died. And as a result of that and the political pressures that came up, now we have said there's going to be no more landfilling and all landfills are going to be cleared in no time at all. And the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy has been given the target of ensuring that the entire waste that is generated is converted into energy. Now, I'm not sure if these are the best solutions that we are talking about, but these kinds of knee-jerk reactions that are coming up to both global and national level challenges, I think is something that we need to worry about. On energy access, we are still relying on extension of the grid, but we don't know what's going to be flowing into the grid. With the kind of revised renewable energy scenario that we are talking about. We made a major announcement because of politics that 100% electricity access would be given to all homes. People will go into people's homes, service providers, and give them electricity access by 2018. And I know that there is chaos in the government on how is it that they're going to be delivering on this. No clear strategy as yet. And so on. I mean, program after program, I think we have these problems. And I'll stop with this quick aside, if you'll give me 1 minute more, on global targets. I think here I will not spend time on this slide, but the essential point that I wanted to make in regard to this slide is that for good reason, I think we have wanted to say that we can meet and we can stay below the 2 degrees Celsius target, and we should be able to work towards arriving at the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. But I think almost all of us in this room would agree that this is going to be an enormous challenge in the time frames that we are talking about. We are more likely to be crossing the 2 degrees Celsius target. But in terms of preparation, in terms of recognizing that this is reasonable probability, I would have liked to say high probability case, we have not really responded to the adaptation challenges. Because on the adaptation side, I think willy-nilly we have gone ahead on the assumption that we are going to remain below the 2 degrees Celsius target, and we will only be dealing, not only, but we will be dealing with the committed climate change and of course the other climate change that will happen for the incremental increase that we are going to see for the 2 degrees Celsius world that we are talking about. We have not even started trying to look at 3 degrees Celsius and what will be the adaptation requirements, if we can, to a 3 degrees Celsius world. And I think it's time for all of us to sit up and say that it's all very good to be positive, but maybe we need to also be preparing, especially governments, for another world so that we are not caught unawares at the end of this, and then sustainable development goals become almost irrelevant in this context if we talk about it. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. We have a bit of time for questions. My request to you as an asking person would be, please stand up, then people see who is asking. And I have, the first hand was here, I guess.
Thank you very much. I'm Kira Finke from the Potsdam Institute, and I was wondering, when you said the contracts are being reopened, Is this referring to branches of solar power that were sold under the Nehru Solar mission? Are they actually reopening those reverse bidding processes, the contracts that emerged there out of?
Yes, I mean all the projects that preceded, for example, 2017 almost, because that's when prices really started coming down, both on solar and on wind, are now being reopened, and developers are being pushed to bring down the price. In a similar fashion, if we have a winning bid in Madhya Pradesh or in Rajasthan that came to a particular price that we are talking about 2.47 in the context of solar, and in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, in the south of India, the price comes somewhat different. The state government there wants the price to match the price in another part of the country, even though the local context may be very different.
And can I just ask a follow-up question? But wasn't it guaranteed that the price stayed stable for like a decade or two?
Yes, it was, but it is so. A lot of things will get into quotes once again, which is not such a good idea, because then the whole program will come to a standstill. But these are the realities that we are having to deal with. Yeah.
Dr. Srivastava, thank you. I'm Rainer Sauerborn from Heidelberg University, and since you are from a technology university, I ask you the question: what's the carbon footprint of producing a lithium-ion battery compared to a fuel cell? Everybody talks about lithium and battery power, Tesla and everything, and few people know that producing this has a huge carbon footprint, more than producing a diesel or a normal gasoline engine. So wouldn't fuel cell be the better options?
I am not a technology person. I'm an economist by training, an energy economist. So I will not be able to answer that question, but it is something that does bother me, that when we are moving in a big way to some of these solutions, we are not really looking at the implications of some of these large-scale programs that we are putting in place. So I'm sorry, I will not be able to give you an answer to the carbon footprint, but I'll take your point.
Thank you.
Okay, many thanks for the questions and for the presentation. So achieving sustainable development until 2030 will not be an easy task. Maja Göpel from Wuppertal Institute will be the next person presenting on a great mindshift needed for such a huge transformation. Welcome, Maja Göpel.
Good morning. As you can tell from the slides, I've moved from the Wuppertal Institute to the German Advisory Council on Global Change, but it's been a recent move, and one that I'm happy about, and one that dovetails nicely on the things that I've been thinking about and working on in the Wuppertal Institute before. That thinking, I only noticed in Johan's presentation, dovetails really nicely from what he's been presenting, because my questions have been around how do we translate the findings about system transformation on the big picture into empowering change strategies that can talk to people and individually make them feel they can become part of making that big picture change come around. And in this, I'll be emphasizing a little bit what I call the soft power, or the cultural side of sustainable development. And my hope would also be that it is part of the question that we touched on just before, presented by Leena. If we don't meet those particular goals, I do think it's very worthwhile to still change the culture with which we are moving forward in development, and the ideas and the stories with which we understand what we're trying to achieve. Even if we miss the 2030, we have 2050 and 2100 to go to as well. So this is the general take where I'm trying to fit in between. And the Agenda 2030 has the title Transforming Our World. And I think we are all ready to say, let's do that. And it did bring me to ask two questions, which is, transformation studies tell you that we always only exposed can really see if we've transformed a system. That leaves us with the question, if we want to intentionally work towards transformation, how can we infuse this? How can we make sure we're not just kind of fiddling around the edges and slowly, incrementally merge onwards, but miss out on this big picture idea of what the transformation should get us to? And the second one was, if the transformations envisioned are supposed to support sustainable development, what is then a high leverage point to get there? Because transformations take place all around us, and to assume that transformation in itself will lead us to more sustainability, I think has been a bit of an under-reflected pitfall or conflation in this community. Because originally transformation has been observed. We saw the 1990s, 1992, the first reaction. Sustainable development was a reaction to understanding how much we're transforming this planet and how this transformation of the planet will then impact our abilities to run future development. And this is why we want to understand which transformations take place and where and how we can intentionally shape the course about the direction. And this is why I think it is important not to argue whether we need transformation or no, but to say, yes, it's happening, and how can we get in there and understand it as an ongoing process. And for me, that gets me to humans. If we want to talk about intentional change making, that will rest with the people that are taking decisions in particular moments. Even if the ecosphere is transforming what we find in place, where we can live and how we can live, it's us that are reacting to it, that is rethinking how we can move forward now and which institutions might help us to achieve those things. So to understand the whole idea of how we get into the social, ecological, technical systems that we're talking about as an outcome of human intentional action. So the sense-making actors with their values, beliefs, and knowledge and worldviews are co-creating the processes that we're talking about, co-creating the institutions, co-creating the infrastructure, co-creating the monetary system that then turns into those path-dependent systems that we're slightly stuck in. But those, of course, shouldn't be understood, and this is what this community is about, without understanding how those systems are impacting the Earth system that can then either continue to feed our process in the former way or not. And then to understand how those existing systems are framing what we think is possible, what we can do in the future, and what is a legitimate, realistic, or desirable future. So to paraphrase Karl Marx, humans make history, and I think this is important to understand. Today's actions, we heard it before, are going to be very influential on what we're going to see in the future. But we're not doing that in a free blank table, blank slates, but we're doing that under the circumstances transmitted from the past. And I think Leena's talk gave us some ideas about how that creates additional challenges. So what is transformability then? And this is one of the definitions that I really appreciate when I'm trying to think about how can humans be enabled to become transformation agents. It's the capacity to create untried beginnings from which to evolve a fundamentally new way of living when existing ecological, economic, and social conditions make the current system untenable. That gets me to the question 1, which says reflexivity, our unique human capacity to rethink what we're doing and why we're doing it, is a key leverage point in changing where we're going in the future. It is the place of transformative intent. And it ties in with purpose. And I think a lot of purpose talk has been coming around recently. What's the purpose of it? I think people understand that the old story, the old ideas, the old ways of explaining this, how we can move forward, are a bit broken. And they start reconsidering, they start reflecting. We have mindfulness movements, we've got spirituality movements, we've got business as usual is not an option, paradigm shift is necessary. All of those terms and calls have been quite ubiquitous. And I think they do come back to the purpose. What is the reason for which we've created our institutions, in particular the economic system that I want to zoom in on right now, because I do feel it is a high leverage point for getting us towards more sustainability. We have to break free from a lot of the ideas and build artifacts that this economic system is composed of. Because when we look at the purpose behind history making today, this is a Google image start. I just punched in those terms. When you look at success, progress, development, and underneath, of course, the more economic terms, it's less surprising. But we see that one and the same pattern. Our imaginary about what it is to have progress and development and success has this curve. And of course, that's the same pattern that we saw before. So yes, population growth has been one driver, but also this idea that everything that history making is about, if it wants to be positive, is about more. And Karl Polanyi has been a great scholar in researching the Great Mindshift from my point of view. He's written a book, The Great Transformation, 1947, where he highlights how this idea has been actually an innovation, a big social innovation, or a great mindshift that took place in the 19th century. This whole idea to say that our development is all about gain or more growth has been new. Today we're stuck in the institutions that we've built around them, but it has been new. So we can also redefine it. We can go back and say, what is the general purpose of economic development today? And how have we then to change the structures and processes and ideas around that? So it is very important to understand this, especially that it's been raised to the level of a justification of action and behavior in everyday life. And I think this is what we see when we want to propose green solutions. We have to argue how much it is going to impact GDP. If you want to say higher social standards, we have to argue how it's going to impact the productivity of our economies or of our businesses. So we have to challenge those terms that kind of limit what we're allowed to suggest as good proposals and as good solutions to move forward. And this is just a few examples I'll run you through very briefly to show how much I feel this blinding effect of a very economistic way of reading what development is about is impacting our economic, social, and environmental sphere of sustainable development, but also the cultural one that I'm talking about here. So where's wealth? We still talk about we're growing, and yet when we look at this is 2011, it probably looks like very different now, especially after the financial crisis reactions. Yes, we are growing, trillions of GDP, but the big numbers are already in the derivatives sector. So the financial sector is sucking up a lot of what we still call wealth. It's not even getting to the real economy anymore. And right now what we're doing is to downgrading social environmental standards so that more growth, more return on investment can happen and go into those derivatives. This is one of the things where I think, talking about different capitals that we need in the future, we have to say financial capital is a totally different animal from other economic capital. Usually it is in one category. We have to understand it's a different animal. It has to be treated differently. Then another one is productivity gains that I touched on before. Big thing right now in the digitalization movement, of course. What do we measure productivity by? For what purpose? Is it just the lowering of costs per unit of output? Is that really a helpful way of looking at what we're trying to achieve in the future? If it means we're going to chug out all those people, make them superfluous because they cost too much in comparison to the computers? And the next one on the environmental issues, when we look at the GDP, which is the lead indicator still, it excludes a lot of the issues, not only on happiness and well-being, and this is Deutsche Bank research. This is not kind of New Economics Foundation. This is Deutsche Bank research. They're knowing this. We are really excluding a lot of the elements that make up economic well-being, living conditions, happiness, but we also are really blind to seeing the environmental destruction that's necessary to keep us growing. You see this small little thing that's called regrettables? That would be one of those things. Oh, damn it. Sad. That went. And I really would like to see the calculations on how much Irma has boosted GDP growth in the United States. Do we call this progress? Or the costs are then going to be measured as growth, because market prices will be measured and calculated as an outcome of having to clean up, having to restore, having to rebuild. But is that progress? No, we have to look at this more differentiated. And then the effects on our culture today, and I think this sums it up very nicely. But of course, we're still measured by what do we earn, how much are you making, how big is your house, all the status symbol elements. And we do forget how much right now, especially after the financial crisis, we see how much the different taxation of labor and capital, how much the crowding out of people out of houses, especially right now in Berlin. We have a huge problem with rents going up because the surplus of financial money doesn't know anymore where to go. So it goes into existing assets and inflates their value, which has massive social costs to everyone else. But it still is our way of looking at things that as much, or the more we earn, the more that we possess, the better we're off. So for me, the soft power in sustainability transformations, to kind of bring it together, is the repurposing of our system. And this is what Donella Meadows has been already writing about. I mean, she's been one of the authors in the 1972 report, obviously, The Limits to Growth, but she's been writing so many beautiful essays and perspectives about how can we make system change come around. And this is from her article called Leverage Points, and it goes into thinking, how can we really have a big impact in shifting systems and their development? And what she's differentiated, usually it's a list of 12, but here it's summarized in the UNEP GEO5 report into 3 layers. And basically what we're looking at mostly in the sustainable development agenda is only on the surface layer, to a bit more efficiency gains, a bit more measuring of how much we've destroyed in the environment, a bit more redistribution. Hardly ever do we really get to the rules and incentives. It's really difficult to change. I mean, the common agricultural policy in Europe, I think, is one of those where you think, oh, Jesus, I know, everyone knows it's not really going to be helpful for sustainable development as it is now, but to get that changed is really difficult, especially when the arguments for why it can't be changed are not based on a different mindset. If the justification and reference frame is not challenged, the proposals will find it much harder to deviate from the status quo. This is the structural power of the status quo and the narratives that have been built into the systems that are now structurally impeding us to change. And this is why, for me, the repurposing of our economies is the high leverage point for sustainability outcomes. And this is why I think the SDGs propose a fantastic framework that gets us towards this. Because we're out of the 3 pillars where everything has to be justified according to more of that curve's growth, into 17 different goals with loads of targets and indicators where we can get imaginative about how can we really make those come around. We just have to lift those targets onto the same level as the GDP growth ones. And it opens up a totally new way of looking what is a desirable and fruitful outcome in the future. That does not mean that we won't have difficulties breaking out of the structures. That does not mean that we can just reinvent the wheel and don't have to look at how can we provide social security systems, etc., when the economy is not growing so much anymore. Maybe it will still be growing, but we have to get out of the idea that everything has to grow in order to be good. It is a dependent variable. Things may grow, things may shrink, some things may grow. It's a reallocation, a structural change in our economies that has to take place. And this is what we want to measure. This is what we want to pay attention on. What we value is what we measure, and what we measure is what we value. It guides us in our decision making. We have to reduce complexity, and we have to make sure that those guides and those spotlights that we're shining on make us see what is crucial for us in the future. And this is why I think it is time to challenge the stories with which we're moving forward. When you look at human development back then, I mean, this fireside storytelling has been huge in making people feel they're part of a community, in having a joint purpose, a joint story about where we're moving, an idea about different roles and participation in making that story come around. So make sure that this fireplace story will not be one where shareholder value has sacrificed our planet, but where the economy and its artifacts and systems are going to serve human well-being within planetary boundaries again. And this is why I think a great mind shift is what we can all work on, regardless of where we are in each of our contexts. Really go at assessing what are the measures, what are the targets, what is the language, what are the words with which we are expressing where we want to go, and what they allow us to see and not to see. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maja, for this fantastic talk. I guess there are a few questions up to that. And I see a first hand here, and the mic is coming.
Thank you. Sam Sellis, University of Washington. In the past decade or two, we've seen a lot of emerging research from judgment decision-making sciences, from behavioral economics, about how people make decisions and how people value things. And I'm wondering how you've used that emerging body of research to think about framing, to think about the language that we should be using in talking about planetary change and how to revalue the decisions that we make.
Mm-hmm. I think it is a very important body of research, but I do see it in 2 camps. One is the nudging one, which really doesn't much believe in human potential for developing. They just say, let's design our infrastructures, our attention architecture differently to kind of make us subconsciously opt for the better products. And of course, that's learning from marketing. And this whole discourse, oh, the state now wants to be paternalistic, it wants to tell us what to do, of course has been mostly flagged by the corporations that are nudging us all day in and out. But they do it in the private realm of private decision-making, free stewardship. And if the state wants to do it, we have this ideological framing of, oh, that's the public space, they shouldn't be doing that, that's encroaching on our freedom. And I think this is why it is a very important body of work to break between this weird dichotomy of the state versus the market, to say we've got structures everywhere, and they do nudge us all day long. And then we can go into seeing how does a re-nudging be an experiential turn that can also go with the rethinking or reflexivity turn. Because we do see from learning theories a lot that it's not only about the rethinking, you have to experience how things can work differently as well in order for them to become more of your habit. And it needs for a certain degree of practice and enabling and habitualization for that to come normal. And this is where I think the two camps can work together quite well in saying, let's go for the easy wins in the just nudging people, but make sure that part of that information architecture we're creating allows for them to get into the reflexive mode as well.
So we have a question here in the back.
Yeah, first, thank you for that talk. I was so relieved to hear someone actually say it. Thank you. Great. I have a question. It's kind of a little bit related to the presentation that was given before, combined with yours. How do you feel about sharing failures and mistakes, especially concerning reaching the SDGs? Because I kind of feel that people are saying, oh, this is not working, I'm afraid this is not working, but nobody's actually sharing what's going wrong. And I think that, how do you feel about that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For me, it's one of the huge cultural changes that needs to happen. And I think it's more and less developed in different countries. And it's, I mean, when you look at the innovation discourse, the Silicon Valley people always say, oh, we can do that, we can talk about failures, we have our failure parties and this and that. That would be great to bring a bit of that idea here, to say experimental search processes of how can we bring that new reality about? How do we invent the lifestyles of the 21st century? We'll need a certain degree of trial and error. And to be bold should not be your stamp on your head that you failed if it doesn't work out. When we look at change, usually it is an radical incremental development. We see that a lot of attempts have been working on the system's readiness to change, and then at one point, at a given point in time, usually at a moment of crisis for the perpetuation of the system, then there's a breakthrough possible. So those people that are celebrated as heroes have a lot of shoulders to stand on and have a bit of, just luck in the kind of time and context that they are pushing forward. And to make that more of a collective, thank you, we've managed this, I think would be a fantastic cultural shift to go around. It is more difficult in politics, and I really struggle with our idea about the political system right now. When all the party systems are rethinking democracy is one of the things I've been immersed in recently, to say, if we have a competition of parties about who can say what is the way forward and who can prove wrong the other people instantly and then make that become the reason for them being voted out. That is not the culture of co-creation, the culture of joint learning, the culture of celebrating if someone had the guts to move forward. So I do feel that this cultural shift is something that is not only in business, but needs to really come into all parts of society, and in particular into the political system with which we want to go through transformation periods that are going to be very rough. And the more we can try to work together on this, rather than winner takes it all antagonism, the less destructive those shocks that we probably will all going to see can play out. Yeah.
So Maja, you've been so perfectly in time with your talk, so we have time for 2 more short questions.
Okay.
The mics are already handed over. I would like to ask other hands to go down. So please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting, and I'm curious to read your book. I haven't done it, but it's free to download. Very nice. My question is, we heard from Leena also now, according to Paris, the rights of indigenous peoples are now also on the climate change governance agenda. How much wisdom have you put also in your thinking or in your book already, or your plan maybe in the future, to learn from people that live close to nature, within the nature, and already have another agenda and other aspirations, but not yet on the political agenda? Not only maybe indigenous peoples, but also people who have different philosophies, like from Southeast Asia, the sufficiency economy and things that come from Buddhism networks. Yeah, I'm interested to hear something about your plans.
Thank you very much. I've always had one leg in activism. So I've been working for 6 years in campaigning and then went back to thinking about what we've been doing. And especially in the campaigning, it has been a lot about finding the common grounds between different, in themselves, following one single issue, as you might say. So indigenous rights, when you look at the major groups on the UN level, on women's rights or farmers or business, so how can we find the common grounds? And I think this is where you're touching on. What is the fundamentals, the values, the perspectives that really allow for us to see more connectivity again? And since you mentioned Buddhism, I think why it has such a renaissance these days is because it puts the emphasis on feeling connected with everything and feeling as part of something, instead of this individualized discourse that came strongly out of the Western Enlightenment movement about everything being torn apart, being particularized, being assessed in depth in its individual item, but forgetting about the network effect, and that you can never understand the quality of an element in a system without understanding how the system is impacting it in itself. So it's very fascinating research on Buddhist thought and complex systems ideas recently, and I found bringing those together really important to bridge the science-society interface. We're only talking about science-politics interface or policy interface, and I do think we need a science-society interface as well, and those would be the elements where we can bring in. It is a bit of a tragedy to say we have to rediscover through our very scientific methods that actually what they've been knowing all along is quite true. And I loved Hans-Peter Dürr, who's been working with me in the World Future Council a lot as an astrophysicist and quantum physicist. He says, that gives us a great potential. We don't have to tell people what they should think, we just can remind them of what they already know, if they allow to contemplate, to think, and to really consider what it is about that we're talking about here.
Okay, a very last, hopefully short question.
Yeah, very short. Anthropocene wegen Institut. The question that I have is, how do you think about the problem of losing integrity between the mindset, the values, and the political actions? Because when you take Germany as a case, we can observe this, that we sound very green internationally, but our actions don't follow the mindset. And I didn't find this problem well represented in your slides, so maybe you want to say something about that.
Great, thank you. I do think Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony is very, very helpful for that, because he describes the consistence between the stories that we tell ourselves and the structures, how they work at a given time. If that is high, then a system runs very smoothly. And he was talking with Machiavelli's thought about how can you lead with least resistance. So people kind of naturally, in their own sense-making, in their own self-governance, are performing the roles that are contributive to making that system function and to be in line with the general idea about where we're going. And then when you see that the structural basis, he's a political economist, so he'll come from the structural productive basis, is not really providing that anymore that we needed for the smooth running, because we've moved from an empty world into a full world, and we additionally also really thought we need more resources for every individual at the same time. Then you get into those structural crises. That's how he talks about this term, where the perpetuation doesn't run smoothly anymore. So that's a crisis moment, the hegemony is broken, and I think everyone feels it. I don't think many people still walk around and say that wholeheartedly and believe it, and that's the potential for change. That's the spot which does feel uncomfortable. And when we talk about the kind of S-curve of change in transformation studies, this tipping point moment, I don't think it should be understood as a tip into one direction and then it's in the other. It's a longer period of back and forth, very politicized, very, yes, moments for reflexivity, for antagonism, but also for potential to really fundamentally change that story and then recalibrate so that the productive structures and the Überbau would be the Marxian term, sort of political structures can work in sync again, and the whole thing can re-stabilize itself. So it is, yes, the crisis moment, and I think when you break it down to the individual level, a lot of people feel this as cognitive dissonance, but also as fear. I don't know what your experiences, but quite often when I come off panels with CEOs or political representatives, after that, on the cocktail element, when you're in the corner, you're right. I can't say that when I'm up there. And this notion of I'm being forced to be splitting my integrity, splitting my roles between who I am at home, who I am as a person, and who I am performing a particular role that this way of running our economies has been defining. I think that is the potential to also get deviators in those camps that should be really happy because they're thriving, they're the winners under the current system.
Okay, many thanks. Another applause for Maja. We come now to our last speaker. It's Dirk Messner from German Development Institute, and it's a presentation without slides. So relax your eyes, enjoy listening. No?
Relax your eyes and listen. Okay, and enjoy, of course. Yeah. So first of all, before you start with your clock and my 50 minutes, I would like to to congratulate you on 25 years of peak research, excellent research, policy-oriented research, one of the most important research institutes in this field. So I've been proud enough to serve on your scientific advisory boards for a decade, so a longer period of time, and I so much appreciate cooperating with many of you. So good luck for the next 25 years, and thank you very much for the party last night. I enjoyed it, dancing there. So. Okay, so this was your birthday, and now let's move into the next part of reflections without PowerPoints. I decided not to work with PowerPoints this morning, and I think what I want to say fits very well in what we already discussed about. I will talk about two great transformations. I think we are at a tipping point when it comes to our societies. And going back to the talks which we already listened to, I mean, Johan, you started to demonstrate to us which kind of transformations we need within planetary boundaries. Complete agreement from my perspective. Then Leena, you reflected upon India, a case in a country in which actors try to accelerate and scale up, no? And the problems emerging in this situation of scaling up and acceleration. And then Maja, you thought about transformation and human mind shift, so transformation in human behaviors. This transformation is not only about technologies, it's not only about incentive schemes, it's something which is very complex. No? And the question which I would like to discuss very briefly now is, if we think about these large-scale transformations, landscape, energy system, urban system, everything we touch, large-scale transformations, how can we balance this with societal change? How can we stabilize, in a sense, and shape and transform the social fabric of our societies, avoiding disruptions and tipping points in our own economies, societies, and at the global scale? So, a situation in which we would push forward large-scale technological transformations but destroy the social fabric of our countries would obviously not work. So this is what I would like to reflect upon a second. The starting point is the following. 2015, we all celebrated Paris and the 2030 Agenda. Fantastic achievement, multilateralism, global cooperation. The first, as Johan rightly said so, the first large-scale idea about human development worldwide, a universal concept, no? Celebration. Only 1 year after that, Trump and Brexit and Mr. Orban and the European Union in crisis. And my point here is that I think we do have two great transformation concepts in front of us, and we need to think about how these two great transformations are interrelated. The first great transformation is ours, no? The sustainability transformation. Johan, Maja, and Leena elaborated so eloquently about that. The other transformation is the Trump transformation, the Brexit transformation. It is about our country first. It is about building new walls. It is about xenophobia. It is about authoritarian countries and rules. It is about challenging science. No? It's exactly the opposite of what we think we needed to do, but it is there. It is another concept to make a great transformation. So I think we need to understand where the causes of the second transformation actually are. So how can we cannot, it's too easy to describe the situation in a way in saying or arguing that 20 to 40% of our countries and our citizens are going crazy. No? Voting for Le Pen, voting for Trump. What has been happening in our societies which pushed us into this situation? And I think that there are four big drivers of the second transformation. And we need to understand these drivers of the second transformation, the authoritarian one, the our country first one, and we need to build these kind of drivers or the answers to these drivers into our transformation strategies. This has a lot to do with what Leena and Maja and Johan said. So the four major drivers of the other transformation. For me, the first one is socioeconomic. No? There are winners and losers, obviously, of globalization dynamics, of technological changes, but also, of course, of our transformation. Decarbonization is deep structural change. So there are winners and losers. If we don't take this into consideration, we will fail. No? This is the first very easy message. No? So this is the first driver. The second driver is that many people are having the impression that things are getting out of control. No, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, the refugee crisis, Ebola moving towards Europe. Who is controlling this? The feeling is no one is controlling it. And the answer is building walls, our country first. This is not our business, Africans to Africa, you know. So uncontrollability. And the third element then of this second great transformation is a deep crisis of our elites. This has a lot to do with our financial system. No? I mean, if you observe the Panama Papers, if you observe, and if people have the impression that at a certain level of income, you can shape your tax balance sheet. No? You can pay taxes, but you need not. If you are clever enough, you can avoid taxes. No? The OECD demonstrating that annually $300 billion are get lost in the OECD with all our good governance systems by tax avoidance. No? This is not only a fiscal problem, it's a democracy problem, a legitimacy problem. No? So people have the feeling that the old social contract that anyone and everyone needs to contribute to our common good, this is not any longer working. No? So crisis of the elite. I think we are part of the crisis. I'm coming back to this in a second. No? Then the fourth element from my perspective is identity issues. We should not leave identity issues to right-wing racists. There are identity issues. I think the refugee crisis in Europe and the debates which we had about refugees and identity of European citizens is only a symptom of something which goes deeper. And I'm coming to this in a second. So if these would be the four drivers of the other transformation which is out there, what can we do about it? What needed we to think about and what needed we to build into our transformation strategies to manage this tipping point in our societies. No? Two big narratives. The first narrative is our narrative. We have a universal concept now, the 2030 Agenda, the 17 and SDGs, but there is a very powerful other narrative around how to deal with it. No? 4 suggestions. Of course, this is not comprehensive, but having 15 minutes, I need to be focused and brief. No? So the first suggestion which I would like to make is that we have to take into consideration the socioeconomic fears which people are feeling pressure from. In our own studies, Stefan, we wrote in 2000, published in 2007, The Great Transformation Towards Sustainability. No? So deep structural change, 450 pages. I think it is a very good study, actually, still. No? But from these 450 pages, only 10 pages about social impacts of the deep transformation we are arguing for. So the new energy system, the new land system, the new urban systems, and then 10 pages, of course, this implies structural change in all these sectors. Many people will be displaced. I mean, this is about very deep structural change. And Leena, you showed this and demonstrated this. We are arguing for even more acceleration of transformational change. So any kind of transformation strategy which we develop needs to be linked directly with social implications and what are we going to do about those. No? If we don't do that, we will produce the anger and fear which we are seeing now regarding the other transformation. This is a very simple message, but we haven't been doing it. No? In our study in 2011, we forgot it. No? Now we are building it in the German Advisory Council on Global Change, step by step, into any study we do. So this is the first very easy answer, the first very easy suggestion. The second suggestion is about, I think, and this is very important, we made huge progress regarding technical concepts. Is Ottmar here? Emission trading schemes. No? Solar energy transformation pathways, incentive schemes, circular economy and concepts how to do this for different kind of sectors. So technically, during the last 15, 20 years, we have been making real progress. No? So many concepts and strategies are there to be implemented. This is very, very good. No? What we are not good at, I think this is Maja's point also, we are not good at translating these kind of technical concepts into narratives of possible futures to create new ideas and visions of what well-being, and you call it progress, Maja, actually is about. No? An efficient emission trading scheme is not attracting anyone, actually. No? We need effective emission trading schemes, and all these technical answers to very complex systems. We are all working on that, but we need to translate this into visions on local scales, in communities, in cities, in nations, in regions, and then worldwide. We are not good enough at that. We need to think hard about how to make this happen. No? So another round of technical concepts, even more sophisticated, without complementing it with this kind of narratives. Johan, this is also part of the world in 2050. No? We do not only want to reflect upon pathways, technical ones. No? We want to link this with narratives which are attractive and compelling for people, and people need to be part of constructing and building these kind of narratives. If we don't get this right, we are failing. So this is my second suggestion. And my third suggestion is, I have to look where is my third suggestion, here it is about the identity issue. So I think we need to take it seriously. We should not argue that the identity discourse, this is the right-wing discourse. No? Human beings are social beings. Maja, you eloquently talked about that. No? Humans belong to a group. We belong to a community. We do have identities. No? We need friends. We need to be part of something. We need to be part of a project. No? And if this kind of identity is being destroyed or being challenged, and in any kind of larger transformation, it will be challenged, we need to work on that. We need to think how to stabilize, transform, and help people to transform regarding their mindsets. This is what you, Maja, exactly talked about. I mean, it's not by accident that any larger transformation in the past has been driven by crises, conflicts, and even war. We got the European Union and the United Nations after 2 world wars. No? So how can we avoid societal disruptions, identity issues, no? The associated disruptions in our transformations with strategies which try to deal with those. No? I think the only answer to that, I mean, you talked about fear and anger, Maja, no? So the other transformation, fear and anger, I think this is completely correct. And we need to build strategies to convince people that there are other options. And we need to develop stories which are attractive enough to build new identities. I will give you 2 or 3 examples from I'm also in the 50s, like you, Johan. No? So attractive ideas which helped me in the past to have orientation or to feel that progress might be out there. No? For me, for example, in mid-70s, I was 10 years old, mid-70s, in Germany, the big idea, free access to education for everyone, this was incredible. For me, this was a fantastic idea for everyone because this was not what our history was about. No? A second big idea was in the northern parts of Europe, the welfare state concept, another kind of market economies, beyond capitalism, no? Equality and equity as a concept which guides society, a big thing. No? This has to do with identity building. And I'll give you a third example. When I have been studying in Spain, in Granada, in Andalusia, no, in mid-80s, studying languages and political science and economics. And for me, it was fantastic to see that these Spanish young people looked at Europe 5 years after Franco. They looked at Europe as a huge future potential. This was their perspective. This was freedom. This was democracy, a big idea. No? So we need to create these kind of attractiveness in our narratives to rebuild different kind of identities because this kind of identities are obviously challenged. No? If not, we could not explain what is happening with these other transformation which is out there. So my last point for the last 2 minutes, my last suggestion is that beyond the 3 points which are already made, I think that we have to work hard in our societies to make clear that from a European perspective now, not from a global perspective, from a European perspective, Leena, no? We have to understand that the transformation towards sustainability in Europe depends upon the transformation towards sustainability and well-being in Africa. If we don't get Africa right, we don't get Europe right. This is what the refugee crisis is about. I mean, all our studies are demonstrating, the German Advisory Council on Global Change, Stefan, we two together and our friends and colleagues, we did a study on that, climate change as a security risk, migration as a result of 4 degrees world in 2050, 60, 70, 80. So this kind of thing needs to become very clear. It cannot any longer neglected that our cooperation with Africa needs to be part of our domestic thinking about Europe. And we are still not at all there. We need to have big ideas. We need to scale up. It goes far beyond aid. Development cooperation is called aid. Aid is not what we need. Real cooperation, long term, is what we need. Don't talk with people offering them aid. No one likes to be helped all the time. What you are looking for is support and cooperation, not aid. So it goes beyond the aid concept mentally, it goes beyond the investments financially, and it goes beyond our political priorities which we have. In our country, on Monday morning, we do have the beginning of new rounds to build a new coalition and a new government. Old style is, and let's look how it works out this time, old style is that the last ministry which is being allocated in these discussions about the next government, the last ministry being allocated is the development ministry. The last one. And science. Science comes even before, Always the last one is development. And what I'm arguing for here is that we need to put cooperation with Africa and then cooperation with other poor countries center stage, because we need to understand that if we don't get well-being SDGs right in poorer countries, we will not get stability and peace in the international system. We have to accept this. If we don't do that, we will fail completely. Last sentence now, 30 seconds. No? I always like to make reading suggestions, so I would like to recommend a book to you, and I would like to urge you, because this has to do with the discussion which we are having here, to read a book written by Anthony Appiah. He's a philosopher from Ghana, working in the United States. The book is about moral revolutions. Moral revolutions. Read it. It has a lot to do, Maja, with what you are thinking about, because I think that the sustainability revolution is not only a technological one, it is one. We need to imagine new technological futures. It's not only an economic one, although it is one, we need new financial schemes and everything. It is also a cultural and civilizational shift. All of the three have been arguing this way. So what Appiah is arguing is that do we have certain patterns when we observe moral revolutions, large scale, in our societies? And he found a pattern. What he is demonstrating is, he has 10 case studies there. What he is demonstrating is that phase one is observing that there might be a problem. Something is going wrong in the system. I think this is limits to growth, 1970 something. There might be a problem. This is always phase one. Then phase two is, there is a problem. I think this is Stockholm, the first environmental conference, beginning of the 70s. This is Brundtland, 87. A lot of Pick's work is exactly that. There is a problem. The third stage is then, we have a problem. That's a difference. There is a problem, theoretically, and something in the system is going wrong, and then we have a problem. This is the third stage. I think Rio 92 was, we have a problem. I think planetary boundaries, Johan and colleagues, this is exactly that. We have a problem. And then the fourth stage always is, we need to solve the issues. So you don't move directly from there is a problem to solving it. You need these different stages. So we are now in, we have to solve the problem. This is Paris, this is the Agenda 2030, this is our discussion which we are having, and this is the fourth stage. And then there is a fifth stage, and we are still not there. I think we can do it, rethinking all the ideas which we have been elaborating on during this conference. It's a wonderful metaphor which Anthony Appiah develops. He says that individually, if you are looking back, or as a group or society, if a society is looking back, arguing, how could we accept that? Then the moral revolution is done. How could we accept, knowing about all these tipping points in the Earth system and still emitting, reducing, producing emissions and using resources, how could we accept that? This is the next step. It's a cultural challenge, and thanks for listening.